Open the hearing on Senate Bill 185.
Members of the committee, we all disagree from time to time about a number of issues, but I think we can agree on one thing, that is that in order for a punishment to be effective, it must be swift and it must be sure. The arguments that are going to be presented today on the part of the proponents are going to argue that the death penalty is neither. Those of us that want to abolish the death penalty abhor acts of violence and depravity as much as those who want to retain the death penalty. And sadly, because we live in a violent society, regardless of what the decision will be on this policy, we will continue to have brutal acts, murderous acts take place. Those of us that support abolishing the death penalty recognize that in order for us to protect our society, we must remove those people who would threaten that very society and incarcerate them and incapacitate them for the rest of their natural life. We support removing them from our midst and imposing a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, a stiff sentence by anybody's admission. You'll hear testimony today in that regard. We propose to alter a state policy that is ineffective and very, very expensive. The fact that the system is expensive means that we draw resources. We will take this session and have a debate, I suspect, at some point about allocating $500,000 for the Office of Public Defender at a minimum just to prosecute the trial in that part of it. There's going to be a second phase of it because it's going to be a sentencing, and then there's going to be appeals that follow. So that $500,000 you can regard as a good down payment on that trial. It detracts from resources that could be used elsewhere. For those of you that went to the prison and saw the conditions there, they're much better now than they were in 1991. But can we do more to do better classification, better training, better hiring, better salaries for the very corrections officers that we want to protect? With a $500,000, I would submit to you that we can. We all grew up with the death penalty. The death penalty is an institution just like every other institution we grew up with. We've taken it for granted. Every time someone challenged it, we would rise to its defense. And just in recent years, we've seen a number of those institutions fail. Too large to fail, they said, and yet fail they did. And others were barely propped up and kept alive. The death penalty is an institution that's been failing under our noses for decades and decades and decades. And it's time to carefully examine it, and I would submit to you to eliminate it. So in maintaining the death penalty, whose company do we keep? The United States is one of the only countries in the Western world of so-called industrialized societies. But whose company do we keep by retaining the death penalty? I'll just read a few. Egypt, China, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, North Yemen, North Korea, and Ethiopia. That's pretty tough company for us to keep. Many, many other countries have said to themselves, we can do better than that. As recently as in 2006, 2 countries eliminated the death penalty. Argentina, Chile, and Uzbekistan followed in 2007. In fact, 5 countries in the entire world perform 93% of all the death penalties imposed in the world. It's often said that the death penalty is a deterrent. Let it be said, it is not a deterrent, and there's factual information galore to underscore that. Those states that impose the death penalty and those regions in the United States that impose the death penalty have higher murder rates than any other region or any other state. Texas, Florida, Virginia. You look at those states, the Southeast itself. And we in Montana often compare ourselves to North Dakota. I'm not sure why. North Dakota doesn't have the death penalty. And you're going to hear testimony that those states eliminate it must be, we run amok with heathens, and yet we use North Dakota as a model that we would like to emulate. It doesn't have the murder, it doesn't have the death penalty, and guess what? Its murder rate is lower than Montana's and has been for decades. Other states that have looked at the death penalty have found the death penalty costs anywhere from 4 to 6 times more to bring a person to trial, to execution, than it does simply to lock them up for the rest of their natural life. Some states have it as high as 10 times. And why is that? The death penalty is different. Death is different, as it says on that sheet that I handed out. There's more appeals. The attorneys that are involved have to have higher training. There's more attorneys. There's a higher standard on every single level in the death penalty has to be attained. And for those of you that argue, well, we ought to do away with appeals and speed up the process, that's a surefire way to ensure that the system won't work and that we will actually execute someone. You will ask me, can you demonstrate that you've actually executed someone that's innocent? And I can't. My question to you is, should we keep doing it until we ensure that we have? And we've come close in this state, and you'll hear a story about that later on. We've been told that all we need to do is use DNA evidence, and you've just had a bill in this committee about DNA. Well, DNA is only available in about 11% of all cases. If you watch television, you think that we all leave DNA behind at every place we go. And yet, in most cases, DNA evidence is not available. And in fact, too many people are on death row in the United States simply on the basis of one person's eyewitness account of what took place. Hundreds of people. And you will hear a story about one instance, and duplicated by many, where a person's been wrongfully sentenced based on faulty eyewitness accounts. We've had 140 people on death row exonerated. 140 people. You could fill up the House chambers and 4/5 of the Senate with that number. Come over and take a look. We'd have 10 seats in the back row left after those exonerees would show up in Montana. Some came within hours of being executed. Some languished in prison, and the legislature changed laws regarding DNA evidence and were later exonerated. Death penalty is absolute, it's final, and we cannot change that outcome. The reason it's important to acknowledge that is because in every dimension of the death penalty, there's human judgment. And yes, it can be faulty on the part of even the public servants that we place so much trust in. Prosecutors, police officers, investigators, eyewitnesses, lab technicians that we've had our own experience with in the state, prosecutors, and yes, judges, and yes, juries. Members of the committee, I'd ask you to listen very carefully to the testimony on both sides, and I'll be available for questions at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wanzenried.